Stuck for 547 days? No way, bro. No way.
Today, we will be looking at 3 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first one in particular involves a sequence of events that rarely happen. The following 2 are even more painful to watch. As always, viewer discretion advised. Thomas Edward Benning, a man who loved adventure, entered Black Cave in Arizona on a quiet day in April 1995. He had explored this cave a few times before, so he felt confident. This time, he went alone. No helmet, just an electric miner's lamp and his sense of direction. It wasn't the safest plan, but he'd done it before. The cave, with its winding...
Dude, why would you ever go alone?
...hidden passages, felt familiar as he entered. The first room was open, but instead of staying on the usual path, he took a side passage, an obscure route that seemed to call to him. It was darker, narrower...
Bro, an obscure route that seemed to call to him? Dude, we literally seen this in the fucking every cave video explained. There's one path that leads to the light and to safety. The other path that seems to call to them. That is called like anal evacuation. Of course they go down anal evacuation, bro.
And after about an hour of crawling and climbing, Thomas realized he'd lost his way. The cave had swallowed him. He tried retracing his steps, but couldn't find the familiar route back. It was a maze of tunnels, and soon his lamp began to flicker. His heart pounded. He needed light to find his way.
Yo, Rox,
Moments later, the light blinked out completely, leaving him in total darkness. He was deep underground, miles away from daylight, alone. With no flashlight and no way to see, he had a desperate idea. He struck a match. The tiny flame barely lit the rocks around him, but it gave him hope, however fleeting. He kept striking matches one by one, using the brief flashes of light to find his way. But matches don't last long. After the last one burned out, Thomas was left in darkness once again. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He crawled, feeling the walls, searching for any sign of an exit. He left small objects behind, his shoe's insole, a torn trash bag, and strips of his clothing, as markers in the darkness. By the time Thomas Edward Benning reached the narrow fissure, he was exhausted, starving, dehydrated, and desperate. His matches were long gone, leaving him in a blackness so thick he couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. His legs were weak. He hadn't eaten or drunk anything since entering, but he had no choice. He had to keep going. In his mind,
I don't feel sorry for this guy. He went in there with no helmet, no fucking light, no nothing.
Somewhere, there had to be a way out. Maybe just around the next corner. That's when he found the fissure, a crack in the rock, barely 4 feet deep, just wide enough to seem like a possible escape route.
This is exactly like the fucking video. This is exactly like the fucking video said.
Maybe this would lead him to an open area, maybe even back toward the entrance. Hope flickered again, just for a moment. He slowly lowered himself down into the gap, trying to wedge his foot onto a ledge. But as soon as his hips dropped past the narrowest point, he realized the mistake. His hips became wedged between the sharp rock walls. He tried to shift his weight, but the rough stone dug into him from both sides, holding him in place. He pushed with his hands against the walls, trying to lift himself back up, but his body wouldn't budge. He thrashed, kicking with what little strength he had left, but each movement only seemed to drive him deeper into the crevice. Thomas was stuck, and there was nothing he could do. His arms, weak from hours of crawling, had no strength left to free him. He clawed at the rock, hands shaking, nails scraping uselessly against the cold, unyielding surface. His legs were pinned, his body locked in place by the very earth that had once fascinated him. Even if he called out for help with his weak voice, the sound barely carried in the dense, empty space. No one could hear him. He was completely alone. Hours turned into days. No one knew where he was. He hadn't told anyone exactly which cave he was going to explore. His wife, worried when he didn't come
What a fucking idiot, man.
home, called the police. They searched for him in every cave he had been to, but couldn't find any trace of him. It took them days just to find his car parked near Black Cave. Rescue teams came, but they weren't familiar with the cave's hidden passages. They searched the entrance, found his shirt and sunglasses, but missed the obscure path he had taken. They went through all the mapped sections, but there were no signs of him. Meanwhile, in the silence of the cave, way down the rescue team, Thomas's breathing slowed, becoming shallow and uneven. His mind drifted, caught between reality and the fog of exhaustion. Days passed, and eventually, the search was called off. No one knew where Thomas was. He was declared missing. Thomas's wife made countless pleas to the authorities, posting flyers and calling anyone who might know something, but the search had been called off. All she had left were memories, wondering if she'd ever know what really happened to him in the dark depths of the cave. It wasn't until December 1996, more than a year and a half later, that cavers Bill Graff, Elizabeth Robb, and Dale Green entered Black Cave. They weren't searching for Thomas, just exploring the cave as part of their mapping project, for which they took the unfamiliar route, the route that was taken by Thomas more than a year ago. About an hour in, they found something strange, a burned matchbook lying in the dirt. Then, they found a broken miner's lamp. The clues were scattered, matchsticks, torn clothing, all retracing the ordeal
Dude, they're
of
gonna find
survival
a dead body
that Thomas went through, leading anyone who dares to follow deeper into the cave. They didn't think much of it at first, but when they returned through the same passage hours later, curiosity got the better of them. They decided to explore the side tunnel, where they'd found the keys and scraps of clothing, all the clues that were left there by Thomas. It was narrow, just 3 feet wide, and led to a tight, low passage. Crawling through it, Rob noticed a shoe. Then, she found a sock. A little further, they saw what looked like a bundle of fur on the cave floor. But as Rob got closer, she realized it wasn't fur. When they all saw it, they froze. It was a horrific sight, and they were taken by surprise. The group had found Thomas Edward Benning. His body had been in the cave for so long. They had heard about his disappearance months ago and couldn't believe their eyes if it really was Thomas, the caver who got lost, and rescuers couldn't find him even after the operation lasted for weeks. They photographed the scene and took the keys they found for identification. Upon closer inspection, they noticed deep scratches in the rock, evidence of his desperate struggle against the cave's unforgiving hold. Before leaving, they placed reflective markers to guide others back to the body and immediately reported the discovery to the sheriff. Days later, a recovery operation began. Cavers were called in to help with the tight spaces, and after several difficult trips into the cave, they managed to recover Thomas's body. His wallet, still in his pocket, confirmed his identity. Thomas had been lost for nearly 20 months, trapped in the cave he had explored so many times before. If only the searchers had known the cave's secrets, had known to call cavers familiar with the hidden passages.
If only the fucking idiot would have told people where he was going and prepared properly. What the fuck? What an idiot. Like, dude, how are you going to go to a cave, not tell anybody, alone, and not even go to the cave prepared?
Maybe then, Thomas could have been found alive. But
Yo, you know what? That's a good point. Why the fuck would you bring a wallet instead of a light? What the fuck is your wallet gonna do in the middle of a cave? You know what's more important than a wallet? A fucking light or another person or a rope or something.
Kept him hidden, deep in the darkness until it was too late. The next story will leave you astonished. It's hard to imagine how anyone could think they'd make it through a crack barely wide enough for a laptop. On August 18th, 15-year-old Tim Smafield and his twin brother Tom set out for an adventure they had eagerly anticipated for weeks. Both were avid explorers, having spent much of their childhood navigating the forests, lakes, and hills surrounding their Arkansas home. This time, their destination was Devil's Den Cave. The hike to the cave entrance took them through dense forest, the familiar chirping of insects filling the air, and the ground beneath their feet grew increasingly rocky. They passed along the edges of crystal-clear lakes before they finally reached the cave's entrance. A gaping hole in the hillside greeted them, cool air seeping out from its depths, inviting them into the darkness. There was a thrill in the unknown, and neither of the brothers hesitated as they made their way inside.
Brothers.
Devil's Den Cave had a reputation for its tight squeezes and deep
what the fuck?
crevices. But for two experienced explorers like Tim and Tom, these challenges only added to the excitement. As they walked deeper into the cave, their headlamps cut through the inky blackness. The cave had an eerie beauty, with smooth water-carved stone and sparkling mineral deposits lining the narrow passages. The air grew cooler the further they ventured, but it was the right-hand crevice.
Whenever I see these cave videos, sometimes, dude, like the size of the hole that people try to fucking go through, I couldn't even fit my fucking big ass head through. Okay?
A smooth water-carved stone and sparkling mineral deposits lining the narrow passages. The air grew cooler the further they ventured, but it was the right-hand crevice, a fissure in the rock, that caught Tim's attention. It was a narrow, 9-inch wide crack, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Tom hesitated for a moment, suggesting they stick to easier sections of the cave, but Tim's curiosity got the better of him.
So Tom
He
is
had
a
always
smart
been the
one.
more daring of the two,
Okay.
the one willing to take risks for the thrill of discovery. Ignoring Tom's caution, Tim squeezed his way into the crevice, determined to see how far it went. As he made his way down into the 20-foot-long, 15-foot-high, and 9-inch wide crack, the walls pressed against his body, forcing him to twist and contort his frame to inch deeper. His foot suddenly hit a fragile patch of rock at the bottom of the crevice, and with no warning, it slipped. Tim's left leg became jammed in the narrow space, wedged tightly between two unforgiving rock faces. His other leg, already resting on the slick walls, gave way as well, causing him to stretch awkwardly, pinned between the rock in a painful and precarious position. A wave of panic rushed through him. He called out for Tom, his voice strained. His left leg was
at
stuck,
least he's with somebody.
and the right leg, which had slipped, was pulling his lower body down. The pressure on his trapped leg was unbearable, and the pain shot up through his knee and ankle. Worse, the walls were too tight for him to adjust his position. Tim felt like his body was being torn apart, battling the agonizing stretch on one side and the crushing weight on the other. Tom, hearing his brother's cries, rushed to the crevice. He crouched at the top, trying to get a better look. The narrow gap made it impossible for him to reach down and help his brother. Tim's leg was stuck fast, and there was no way Tom could pull him out on his own. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Tom bolted out of the cave, sprinting through the forest, his heart pounding in his chest. By 5:30 p.m., Tom had reached the park's visitor center, breathlessly telling the rangers what had happened. Jeremy, Bruce, and Tim Scott,
they
two
might save him.
experienced park rangers,
They might save him.
grabbed their rescue gear and followed Tom back to the cave without hesitation. As they trekked through the familiar landscape, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. When they arrived at the cave entrance, they were met by the cool, damp air rushing from its depths. Bruce and Scott quickly assessed the situation, preparing themselves mentally for what they might encounter in the tight, dark passageways. Upon reaching the right-hand crevice, they realized Tim was far deeper in the crack than they had expected. The narrow passage made it difficult even to see him clearly. His voice echoed faintly up through the rock, strained with pain. The rangers quickly realized that the situation was more complex than they had hoped. It wasn't just a matter of pulling Tim free. His foot was jammed tightly, and any wrong move could worsen his injuries or send him deeper into the crevice. With no time to lose, the rangers decided to try using tubular webbing they had brought. They tossed one end down to Tim, instructing him to tie it around his body. Tim, though in considerable pain, managed to loop the webbing around his torso.
Okay.
Bruce and Scott tried to
Oh
pull
my
him
God.
up, but the narrow crevice and the awkward angle of his body made it impossible to lift him with brute force alone. Tim cried out as the pressure on his trapped leg became too much. Realizing this was a more delicate situation than they initially thought, Bruce called for backup, contacting Park Superintendent Jesse Cox and asking for cave rescue teams to assist. By 7:50 p.m., the cave rescuers had arrived, and the group formed a plan. Pulling Tim sideways through the crevice wasn't going to work. The only option was to lift him straight up, but they had to do it carefully. Any misstep could worsen his injuries. They fashioned a loop from the webbing and prepared to hoist him up. Ranger Bruce climbed onto a ledge above the crevice, positioning himself directly over Tim.
Oh,
He
God,
lowered
what
the
if he
loop
gets
down,
stuck?
encouraging Tim to work it beneath his arms and around his chest. Tim, exhausted and in pain, followed their instructions. As the rescuers began to pull, inch by inch, Tim's body slowly started to rise. Every tug brought excruciating pain as his leg fought against the rock,
Jeez.
but he knew this was his only chance. His trapped foot finally loosened, and the rangers pulled him higher until at last, he was within arm's reach of Scott. The team gave a final pull, and with a grunt, they freed him from the rock's grip.
Holy shit.
It was 8:20 p.m. by the time Tim was pulled from the crevice. His legs were bruised and swollen, but miraculously, he had escaped without any severe injury.
Jesus.
Hold on if you've made it this far, because the last story is even more shocking. The person trapped in the cave began experiencing things that usually don't happen.
Bro, what? Dude, I need a second to process. Okay, so they saved him.
October 1989, 18-year-old Rachel Cox was on her first caving adventure at Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota.
Dude, what's up with
She
all
and a
these
group of
Coxes,
college
man?
students
Jesse
were
Cox,
participating in
Rachel
a mock
Cox.
search and rescue operation after 2
Another
weeks
Cox,
of exploring
bro.
the cave. Deep beneath South Dakota's Wind Cave National Park, Rachel Cox thought she heard her instructor laughing from a nearby passage. She and a group of college students had been exploring the cave, but now they had split into teams, racing to find the instructors who were hiding in different parts of the cave. Cox convinced her team that the instructor was close by. She and a teammate left their backpacks behind and crawled through a narrow was close by.
Dude, why does this
She and a teammate left their
why does this backpack animation look like something out of Among Us?
backpacks behind and crawled through a narrow tunnel to investigate. However, when they reached the spot, the instructor wasn't there. Frustrated, her teammate criticized her decision and decided to head back.
Damn, okay.
Cox, also annoyed, paused briefly before getting ready to follow him. That's when her lamp suddenly went out. In the pitch-black silence, Cox cursed herself for not noticing her lamp was low on fuel. Following her training, she decided to stay put and wait for help. But as more time passed, she considered trying to crawl back through the tunnel she had come from. She felt for the opening, squeezed through, and found herself in the wrong passage,
Oh,
even more
God.
lost than before. With no pack or working light, Cox was without food, water, or warmth. She knew her biggest danger was hypothermia, so she forced herself to keep moving. She made as much noise as she could, shouting, singing, banging her lamp against the cave walls, and even reciting lines from Shakespeare's As You Like It to stay calm and signal for help. Meanwhile, her fellow students and instructors were searching the area where she had disappeared. Rob McLeod, one of her teammates, said, "We had just spent 2 weeks in that cave, and we knew it pretty well. We didn't understand where she could be." Cox tried to retrace her steps, hoping to find the spot where she got lost. But instead, she ended up going deeper into the cave. As the hours stretched on in the cold darkness, hunger gnawed at Cox's stomach, making her feel weak and delirious. Her throat was parched, and her limbs felt heavy as if they didn't belong to her anymore. The lack of food and water twisted her mind, causing her thoughts to race and blur.
Dude.
At times, she wasn't sure if the strange noises around her were real or just her mind playing tricks. She began to hear whispers in the silence, voices from the cave, almost like it was alive, urging her to keep moving. Even as exhaustion and
losing
starvation
her
pushed
mind.
her closer to madness. Cold, hungry, and desperate, time lost all meaning. And as her condition worsened, she thought she heard a gentle voice from the cave telling her, "I am the womb of Mother Earth. You are safe. I will birth you."
What the fuck?
She also saw visions of glowing lights and imagined her relatives praying for her return. As the search dragged on with no sign of Cox, the instructors notified the park rangers. The National Park Service quickly mobilized more cavers, starting with locals and then reaching out to experts from other states. Jim Nepstad, a former wind cave specialist, got the call on Monday evening. He flew in from Kentucky and helped coordinate the search. Wind Cave is the easiest cave in the world to get lost in, Nepstad explained. The passages are so dense, it's a three-dimensional maze. After about 30 hours of searching, Nepstad and his team expanded their search to more remote parts of the cave. One of the volunteers finally heard Cox's call for help after hearing rocks fall in the distance. Cox recalled seeing a light approaching, and then a man with a beard asking, "Rachel, are you ready to leave now?" She was so disoriented that she replied, "Are you God?" It took another 2 hours to pull Cox out of the cave. She was weak, dehydrated, and mildly hypothermic, but she had no serious injuries. After a night in the hospital, she was reunited with her father, who had flown in to see her. Later that day, she rejoined her group at their campsite. Though physically fine, Cox was overwhelmed by shame for the mistakes she had made. She couldn't stop thinking about how her actions had triggered such a large search effort, and she worried about the damage that may have been caused to the cave's fragile environment. For many years, Cox believed that being trapped in the cave was the most traumatic thing she would ever face.
Well, I mean, yeah. That was a good video. Yeah, that's a good point. Rare happy ending twice in a row. Yeah, that's a good point.